In the heart of Liverpool's rough streets, Callum Morgan's story began like so many others. Born into a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce, he quickly learned that survival meant finding ways to stand out. At first his world revolved around small-time hustling. He sold counterfeit trainers and knockoff designer jackets out of the back of his car, making enough to impress his friends but never enough to truly escape poverty. What made Callum different was not just his ambition, but his ability to charm those around him. People trusted him even when they knew he was bending the rules. He had the kind of presence that drew others in, and he used that presence to build connections that would later carry him far beyond the streets. By his late teens, Callum was already moving beyond petty schemes. He had discovered the fast money in stolen goods, working with local thieves to shift electronics, phones, and jewelry. Every deal added to his reputation as someone who got things done. But beneath the surface, Callum wasn't satisfied. He craved more than just quick cash and the respect of street-level hustlers. He wanted influence, wealth, and a name that would echo far beyond Liverpool. Those around him could see his hunger, and in the world of crime, ambition was both a blessing and a curse. Callum's first real break came when he crossed paths with older figures already involved in drugs. They saw in him a useful quality, confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the discipline to stay calm under pressure. He began running small packages across town, collecting payments, and keeping his mouth shut. Unlike others who bragged about their earnings, Callum stayed quiet. This silence earned him the trust of men who normally viewed outsiders with suspicion. Soon he wasn't just a runner, he was a rising figure who could be relied on to handle responsibility. As his earnings grew, so did his lifestyle. Callum upgraded his wardrobe, bought flashier cars, and rented apartments in nicer parts of the city. To outsiders, he looked like a young man who had found early success in business. To those in the know, he was carving out his place in the underworld. His name began to circulate in whispered conversations in pubs, gyms, and clubs across Liverpool. Some admired him for his daring rise, while others resented his quick climb up the ladder. But none could deny that Callum Morgan was different. He wasn't reckless like many of the young men who tried to make it big. He played the long game, studying every move, planning every deal, and keeping himself at arm's length from the dirtiest parts of the work. What made his rise even more remarkable was his ability to switch between worlds. In the morning, he could sit at a cafe in a crisp shirt, talking politely to locals who believed he was an ambitious entrepreneur. By night he could be in a smoke-filled flat, counting cash stacked high from drug sales. This double life gave him cover and allowed him to build a growing empire right under the noses of those who thought they knew him best. For Callum, the streets of Liverpool weren't just where he came from, they were the foundation for the empire he was determined to build, no matter the cost. Callum's empire did not grow overnight. It began with cautious steps, clever decisions, and an unshakable belief that he could rise above the street-level dealers who usually burned out fast. Once he had established himself as someone trustworthy to his early connections, he started looking outward, beyond the limits of Liverpool. The local market was already crowded, and Callum understood that if he wanted true power, he had to think bigger. His eyes turned toward Europe, where suppliers could provide endless amounts of cocaine and ecstasy, the kind of products that fueled nightclubs and raves across Britain. Through contacts, he met at underground parties and shady business trips. Callum linked with Dutch suppliers in Amsterdam. These men were professionals, far more organized than the small gangs back home. They moved product in bulk, and they were willing to work with anyone who could guarantee money on time. Callum quickly proved himself. He didn't waste time showing off or making sloppy mistakes. Payments were clean, pickups were smooth, and the drugs flowed into Liverpool with little resistance. For the first time, Callum was no longer just another player in the game. He was starting to control the board. His shipments came in clever disguises. One week, crates of fruit arrived at a warehouse with hidden compartments filled with pills. Another time, a shipment of flat-pack furniture contained bricks of cocaine sealed tightly to avoid detection. Callum made sure he never personally touched the packages. Instead, he had layers of people handling different parts of the process. Some unloaded trucks, others distributed the product, while Callum stayed behind the scenes, directing everything like a conductor leading an orchestra. This distance kept him safe from direct evidence, and it created the illusion that he was untouchable. With each successful delivery, the money grew. Callum laundered his profits through small businesses, including his Liverpool bar, which became a front for his dealings. The cash kept rolling in, so much that he had to buy multiple safes to store it before it could be cleaned. He began buying properties, not only to flaunt his wealth, but also to hide the constant flow of dirty money. Expensive watches, designer clothes and flashy cars became his trademarks, signs that he was no longer the struggling hustler from the backstreets, but a man of serious influence. But power came with enemies. Rival dealers noticed their profits shrinking as Callum's network spread further into their territories. Violence simmered beneath the surface, and more than once, one of his safe houses was raided by masked men trying to steal his product. Callum responded with calculated coldness. He tightened security, recruited tougher enforcers, and sent quiet warnings to anyone who thought about crossing him. Those warnings were enough to silence most rivals, and his reputation only grew stronger. By his late 20s, Callum had turned himself into one of the most feared and respected figures in Liverpool's underworld. To outsiders, he was a successful businessman with expanding ventures. To those inside, he was the man who controlled the flow of drugs that fueled an entire city's nightlife. He was no longer chasing opportunity, he was creating it, and with each passing year, his empire reached further, stretching from the dark alleys of Liverpool to the docks of Europe. The young hustler had become a kingpin, and he was just getting started. Callum Morgan's rise was not only measured in wealth or power, it was also defined by the careful construction of a double life. While the streets of Liverpool whispered his name with fear and respect, the public face he presented to the world was strikingly different. To neighbors, shopkeepers and local families, he appeared as a young entrepreneur who had simply worked hard to make his mark. He invested in property, quietly purchasing apartment buildings and commercial spaces under shell companies, giving the illusion of legitimate business acumen. He renovated derelict apartments and rented them out, building a reputation as a forward-thinking landlord. This facade of respectability was carefully maintained, a mask that concealed the underworld empire he had built. His generosity played a key role in reinforcing this image. Callum donated to local football clubs, sponsored charity events, and even quietly paid for children's sports equipment in schools across Liverpool. On the surface, he was the kind of man who gave back to his community, a young success story who had risen above the difficulties of his upbringing. Few would have imagined that behind this veneer was a man who controlled shipments of cocaine and ecstasy that moved through the city, leaving a trail of addiction, debt, and fear. It was this ability to balance two worlds that made him so dangerous. He could manipulate public perception as easily as he manipulated the drug market. The contrast between Callum's public persona and private life was stark. During the day, he attended property meetings, visited construction sites, and appeared at networking events with a sharp suit and confident smile. He spoke politely, remembered faces, and laughed with ease, convincing everyone that he was simply a young businessman with ambition. But by night he was elsewhere, meeting with trusted lieutenants, reviewing encrypted messages detailing shipments, and planning moves against rivals. Every detail was calculated, every interaction deliberate. Callum understood that his success depended as much on appearances as on action. If people believed in the respectable version of him, fewer would question the wealth and influence he displayed, and fewer would suspect the criminal network operating behind the scenes. This duality became his greatest weapon. Law enforcement agencies struggled to build a case against him because every lead seemed to end in dead ends or plausible deniability. Friends and acquaintances offered glowing character references. Neighbors described him as courteous and reliable, and even small-scale business owners praised his contributions. The careful balance of visibility and secrecy allowed him to operate with minimal scrutiny. His name circulated in elite circles not as a criminal but as a young entrepreneur to watch. It was a sophisticated game of misdirection that few could see through. Even within his own organization, Callum maintained distance. He rarely attended risky operations in person, preferring to communicate through encrypted messages and trusted intermediaries. This approach minimized exposure and protected his public persona while allowing him to control every facet of his criminal empire. As a result, while police were aware of the growing drug problem and the mysterious figure orchestrating it, they could not tie him directly to the crimes. Callum's life during this period was a delicate balance of performance and strategy. Every donation, every handshake, every property purchase was part of a larger plan to solidify his respectability while expanding his power. The streets of Liverpool feared him, while the city's polite society admired him. It was a dual existence that required constant vigilance, but it worked brilliantly, at least for now. In the world Callum had created, perception was everything, and he had perfected the art of appearing untouchable. His empire flourished in the shadows while the sunlight fell only on the carefully constructed illusion of legitimacy. Callum Morgan had built an empire in Liverpool, but even the most calculated criminal needs an escape, and for him, that escape was Ibiza. Each summer he flew to the Spanish island with a carefully curated circle of associates, friends who shared his love of excess, but also knew the rules of discretion. Ibiza was more than a playground. It was a stage where he could live out the fantasies that his city-bound life constrained. Villas perched on cliffs, overlooking the sea, became temporary fortresses of indulgence, each one outfitted with private pools, luxury cars and rooms stocked with high-end alcohol and exotic foods. Here, far from Liverpool, Callum could taste the lifestyle that his empire funded, a life of complete control and limitless pleasure. The parties he threw were legendary, among a select circle. Guests arrived in yachts or helicopters, dressed in designer clothes and eager to experience the chaos of music, lights and alcohol. DJs spun tracks late into the night, while champagne flowed endlessly, and the villa's interior became a blur of movement and neon. Despite the extravagance, Callum ran these events with precision. Security was tight, entry was by invitation only, and everyone inside knew to respect the rules. He had learned early on that even in a paradise like Ibiza, carelessness could be fatal. These parties were a symbol of his power, a clear message to anyone who knew his name, that he was untouchable, even thousands of miles from home. But Callum's love for the island carried risks. Local authorities and international law enforcement had begun to take notice of a certain pattern. A young British man, always surrounded by luxury and known associates with criminal records, traveling back and forth with increasing frequency. Surveillance teams in Spain started to track his movements, noting the villas he rented and the vehicles he used. Despite his wealth and careful planning, the freedom he felt in Ibiza made him slightly reckless. He was more relaxed than usual, trusting the environment around him, simply because he was far from the streets of Liverpool. It was a rare vulnerability in an otherwise meticulous existence. Callum's network benefited indirectly from these trips. While he partied, he communicated through encrypted phones and coded messages, directing shipments and monitoring his empire remotely. His associates in Liverpool handled the day-to-day operations, but he remained the central node, the decision-maker. From a sun-drenched balcony in Ibiza, he could oversee everything with the ease of a man who had built his own kingdom. The island offered both indulgence and a sense of omnipotence, a place where money, charm, and reputation gave him control over those around him. Yet, the very visibility that made Ibiza alluring also made it dangerous. Photos from the parties occasionally circulated online, posted by reckless guests or social media accounts. Law enforcement noticed the patterns, the same faces, the same villa, the same luxury vehicles. While they could not yet tie him to specific crimes in the UK, they were beginning to understand who he was and the magnitude of his operations. For the first time, Callum was a figure under international scrutiny. Despite these looming threats, he continued to indulge. Nights bled into mornings filled with sun-soaked recovery and endless planning. Every detail, from the timing of shipments to the layout of the villa, was calculated to maintain the illusion of carefree excess. But the longer he stayed, the more he exposed himself. Ibiza, for all its beauty and freedom, was slowly becoming a trap, one that law enforcement was quietly preparing to spring. In his quest for escape, Callum was unknowingly walking toward the one moment that would shatter his empire. Back in Liverpool, cracks began to form in Callum Morgan's carefully constructed empire. For years his network had operated with near-perfect precision, shipments arriving and leaving with minimal interference. But the law has a way of finding patterns, and Callum's rising profile had drawn the attention of both local and international authorities. The first serious blow came when a trusted lieutenant was caught during a routine customs check in Dover. A shipment, cleverly disguised in crates of fruit, was intercepted, and the man in charge of its delivery found himself facing a long prison sentence. The arrest sent ripples through the organization. It was a stark reminder that no matter how cautious Callum had been, the chain was only as strong as its weakest link. The betrayal of a close associate compounded the problem. One of his longtime lieutenants, perhaps motivated by fear or greed, began cooperating with police. They provided names, locations, and coded messages that traced directly back to Callum. For the first time, law enforcement had the evidence they needed to connect the dots. Callum had always been careful to distance himself from dangerous operations, letting others handle the high-risk work. But this betrayal highlighted the vulnerability inherent in any criminal network built on loyalty and fear. Even the most trusted individuals could become liabilities, and suddenly, the untouchable Kingpin had become a target. The pressure mounted on multiple fronts. Rival gangs, sensing weakness, began testing the boundaries of Callum's influence. Turf wars erupted in neighborhoods that had long been under his control, and local dealers started pushing back against his distribution networks. Violence flared sporadically, with arson attacks on warehouses and armed confrontations in alleys. Callum's enforcers worked to contain the chaos, but the strain was evident. The empire he had built with meticulous care was showing signs of stress, and even his closest allies began to question whether he could maintain control. As the net tightened, surveillance intensified. Police monitored phone calls, vehicle movements, and financial transactions. They studied his patterns, noting the trips abroad, the villas in Ibiza, and the encrypted messages exchanged between him and his network. Every action he took was being recorded, every habit catalogued. Callum, usually calm and calculating, could feel the walls closing in, though outwardly he continued to project the image of control and confidence. Inside the organization, paranoia began to spread. Callum issued stricter rules, reducing in-person meetings and demanding more secure communication methods. Trust became a rare commodity, and even loyal lieutenants hesitated to take bold actions without explicit approval. Every intercepted shipment, every new piece of intelligence, reminded them that the empire's foundation was weakening. For the first time, Callum faced a situation he could not entirely control. An empire that depended on secrecy, obedience, and timing was now vulnerable on all three fronts. Despite these setbacks, Callum refused to surrender. He intensified his operations, redirecting shipments, securing safe houses, and tightening his inner circle. He continued to balance public respectability with criminal influence, maintaining his image as a legitimate businessman while working behind the scenes to stabilize his network. Yet the cracks were no longer invisible. Law enforcement now had a clearer picture of who he was, and every move he made was being scrutinized with precision. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was now under siege, and the Kingpin himself had to confront the reality that a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Callum Morgan and the sprawling network he had built. Every decision, every shipment, and every party abroad could now carry consequences far beyond what he had ever faced before. For the first time, the carefully balanced life of the notorious drug kingpin was unraveling, and the consequences would be unavoidable. Ibiza had always been Callum Morgan's playground, a place where the bright sun and endless parties masked the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. That summer, he arrived earlier than usual, eager to reclaim the freedom and indulgence the island offered. His latest villa overlooked the sparkling Mediterranean, a sprawling estate with infinity pools, luxury cars parked along the driveway, and security personnel stationed discreetly around the property. Inside, the rooms were alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Callum moved among his guests with practiced ease, the air of untouchable confidence surrounding him like a shield. But this time, the very visibility that he loved would become his undoing. Weeks of surveillance by Spanish authorities had culminated in a coordinated operation designed to catch him red-handed. Undercover officers had observed his arrival, monitored his interactions, and mapped out the villa's layout. Helicopters, vehicles, and armed units were positioned at key points around the property, ready to move in at a moment's notice. What made Callum so vulnerable was not just the size of the party but his own behavior. He had grown comfortable in his freedom, trusting that the island's glamour and his carefully maintained persona would shield him from any consequences. The party itself was the perfect distraction. Music pounded from high-end speakers, strobe lights cut through the darkened rooms, and guests in designer clothes danced and laughed as if oblivious to the world outside. Exotic cocktails were served, and trays of luxury hors d'oeuvre moved from hand to hand. Callum wandered through the crowd, smiling, raising glasses, and ensuring everyone felt included. To him, this was a performance of power, a display of wealth and influence that reinforced his untouchable image. Yet each movement was being tracked, each step calculated by law enforcement waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the night wore on, the operation reached its climax. Outside the villa, Spanish police units quietly surrounded the perimeter, cutting off all potential escape routes. Helicopters hovered overhead, their presence hidden from most guests by the villa's architecture and the late hour. Then, at the break of dawn, the strike began. Officers moved in with precision, entering the property from multiple angles. Confusion spread through the villa as guests awoke to the unexpected intrusion. Alarms blaring and security scrambling. Callum, still groggy from hours of partying, was caught off guard. His attempts to flee were futile, the villa's exits already sealed by the authorities. Within minutes, Callum was in handcuffs, removed from the villa amid shocked stares and murmurs of disbelief. Luxury cars, designer clothes, and flashing cameras offered no protection against the reality of the operation unfolding around him. The carefully cultivated image of untouchable success evaporated in a single, decisive moment. Spanish officers, working in coordination with British authorities, had successfully executed a plan years in the making, bringing down one of Liverpool's most notorious figures in the most public and undeniable way possible. For Callum, the arrest was a turning point. The freedom he had taken for granted, the illusion of control that had defined his life, was shattered in an instant. As he was escorted from the villa and placed into a police vehicle, he understood that his empire, built over years of calculated risk and careful management, would soon face its ultimate reckoning. The island that had symbolized indulgence and power now marked the beginning of the end. The Kingpin who once ruled the shadows of Liverpool and the parties of Ibiza had been caught, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the sun-soaked villa walls. The arrest of Callum Morgan sent shockwaves through Liverpool and beyond. Overnight, news outlets plastered his face across headlines, labeling him the Ibiza Kingpin, and detailing the audacious capture that had unfolded in the sun-soaked villas of Spain. The city that had once whispered his name with a mix of fear and admiration now reacted with disbelief and outrage. Journalists dug into his past, uncovering the double life he had maintained for years. A young businessman and philanthropist by day, a ruthless drug lord by night. For many the revelation was shocking, but for law enforcement, it was the culmination of years of patient surveillance and meticulous investigation. In the weeks that followed, Callum's empire began to unravel. Authorities traced the flow of drugs, money, and communications, connecting his name to numerous shipments of cocaine and ecstasy that had flooded Liverpool and other UK cities. Testimonies from former associates painted a picture of a man who was both charismatic and terrifying, someone who commanded loyalty through fear as much as respect. Bank records revealed layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, exposing how he laundered vast sums of cash while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate businessman. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving little room for doubt that Callum had built one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in the country. When the case finally went to court, it became a spectacle in its own right. Reporters filled the public galleries, eager to witness the downfall of a figure who had once seemed untouchable. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence: intercepted messages, surveillance footage, testimonies from former lieutenants, and financial records detailing the extensive scale of his operations. The courtroom watched as the carefully curated image of Callum as a respectable entrepreneur crumbled. Every facade he had maintained for years was stripped away under the glare of legal scrutiny, revealing the ruthless ambition that had driven him to the top of Liverpool's criminal underworld. Callum himself remained composed, though the weight of the evidence was undeniable. He maintained the stoic exterior that had served him so well in the streets. But behind it, the reality of his situation was inescapable. The jury listened intently as prosecutors detailed the logistics of his empire: the coded messages, the hidden shipments, the layers of intermediaries designed to protect him from exposure. Each revelation added another layer of understanding about the scale of his operations and the meticulous planning that had gone into maintaining them. It was clear that for years, Callum had operated at a level far beyond that of typical street-level criminals, and that his reach had extended across borders and ocean. When the sentencing finally arrived, it was as decisive as it was inevitable. The judge described Callum's crimes in stark terms, emphasizing the destruction his empire had caused in communities, families, and individual lives. The sentence reflected not just the scale of his operations, but also the calculated manner in which he had pursued power and wealth, exploiting the loyalty and fear of those around him. The courtroom was silent as he was handed decades in prison, a stark contrast to the carefree Kingpin who had once thrown lavish parties in Ibiza. In Liverpool, the fallout was immediate. Former allies scrambled to protect themselves, rival gangs tested the new power vacuum, and the community began to grapple with the shadow that Callum's reign had cast. To many he was a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by morality. To others he remained a figure of fascination, a symbol of a dangerous allure that had captivated the city for years. In that courtroom, the story of Callum Morgan, the rise, the empire, and the ultimate downfall was sealed, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt Liverpool for years to come. Even after Callum Morgan was behind bars, the impact of his empire continued to ripple through Liverpool. His arrest did not erase the network he had built, nor did it undo the damage inflicted over years of operation. Streets that had once been under his strict control became battlegrounds for rival gangs, eager to claim territory. Violence, intimidation, and turf wars erupted in neighborhoods that had grown dependent on the stability, albeit a violent one, that Callum had imposed. Families and communities were left to pick up the pieces, coping with the fear and loss that had been a constant backdrop to life under his reign. The city felt both relief and lingering unease, as though the removal of one figure left a vacuum that no one could fill without consequences. The empire that Callum built had been vast and sophisticated. Even in prison, his influence was evident through the loyalty of those who had once worked for him. Some former lieutenants tried to maintain operations, but without the strategic mind and authority that Callum had commanded, chaos ensued. Shipments went missing, deals fell apart, and arrests continued as police exploited the weaknesses in the fractured network. What had once been a well-oiled machine of smuggling, distribution, and money laundering became a patchwork of desperate attempts to survive in a landscape that had shifted overnight. The stories of addiction and loss painted a human cost that statistics could never fully capture. Communities in Liverpool still dealt with the fallout of drugs that had flooded streets, destroyed families, and ruined lives. Children who had grown up in neighborhoods where Callum's reach had been strong had witnessed violence and intimidation firsthand. The fear that had been a tool of control under Callum's leadership lingered, leaving psychological scars that would take years to heal. To some, he remained a figure of fascination, the embodiment of danger and charisma intertwined, even though his freedom had ended. Rival gangs, emboldened by his absence, escalated conflicts in ways that often mirrored Callum's own ruthless methods. These power struggles were more chaotic and unpredictable, lacking the discipline that had kept Callum's empire running smoothly. Neighborhoods that had known relative stability under his control now experienced a surge in violence, prompting increased police presence and community efforts to regain safety. The contrast highlighted the paradox of Callum's reign. Despite being a criminal, his authority had imposed a certain order that even law enforcement had come to anticipate. Callum's legacy extended beyond the criminal world into the cultural imagination of Liverpool. His story became the subject of speculation, documentaries, and online discussions. Some portrayed him as a cautionary tale, a man whose ambition and cunning led to his eventual downfall. Others romanticized his rise, fascinated by his ability to outsmart rivals and evade capture for so long. Yet for those directly affected, families, victims, and former associates, the consequences were very real and far from over. Ultimately, Callum Morgan's story served as a chilling reminder of the reach and impact of organized crime. He had climbed from the streets to the heights of wealth and influence, but his empire was built on fear, secrecy, and exploitation. His fall did not erase the consequences of his actions, nor did it undo the lives that had been touched by his rise. In the end, Callum's life was a lesson in power, ambition, and the inescapable consequences of choices made in pursuit of domination. His name would be remembered in Liverpool, not only for the notoriety he achieved, but for the shadow he left behind. A shadow that would continue to shape the city long after the Kingpin himself was gone. Callum Morgan and his inner circle ruled Liverpool streets with fear and cunning, but their lavish Ibiza parties would become the trap that brought the notorious Kingpin down.